Can we learn from the past? Of course, you all say. If not, why would you study history otherwise? Yet, among academic historians, it's far from established that the past has anything to teach us. Tonight, social philosopher Roman Krznaric will kick the academic hornet's nest, and he will argue that there are actually intriguing lessons to be learned from the past with which we can save humanity's future. Welcome here in Lux during this session on the history of tomorrow. I welcome you on behalf of Radboud Reflects and the publisher Ten Haven. And there will be three speakers tonight, or three people tonight here on this stage. And I will introduce them now. The first is, of course, social philosopher Roman Krznaric. He is a social philosopher. He is a fellow at Linacre College in Oxford and also a member of the Club of Rome. He is a prolific author who has written many popular philosophical books, among which one on how to be a good ancestor, on how to be empathetic, but also the latest edition, History for Tomorrow. And he opens this evening with a 45-minute lecture. After the lecture, starts with a bang. After the lecture, Roman will be interviewed together with Charley Boerman. Charley Boerman is a cultural studies scholar here at Radboud University, and she studies how the traumatic experience of the past are used and abused in political conflicts. I am Adriaan Duijman. I am a historian from the KU Leuven, specialized in applied history, and I will moderate this evening. Roman thinks that we should look millennia back in the past, but also 7 generations into the future. But we don't have all that time of the world. So please, without further ado, please welcome Roman Krznaric with a warm applause.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, hello to you all, and thank you for that introduction. So, the last time I spoke at Radboud Reflects, about 6 or 7 years ago, I talked about a previous book of mine called Carpe Diem, about seizing the day. And that was a book about humanity's relationship with the present moment. And then I wrote the other book that was just mentioned there, The Good Ancestor, which is about humanity's relationship with the future. And my new book, History for Tomorrow, is a sort of third part in a loose trilogy. And this one is about our relationship with the past. And I think that one of the reasons for thinking so much about the past is that history, in a way, is one of the most undervalued resources we have for thinking about the future of humanity. You know, here we are in an age of polycrisis. We've got climate emergencies, we've got risks from artificial intelligence, we've got threats to democracy, growing inequalities. And yet, so often, our politicians, our policymakers are caught in the present moment, the tyranny of the now, finding it hard to look beyond the next opinion poll or the latest tweet. Or alternatively, they're often very much crossing their fingers, in a sense, hoping that new technologies will come to our civilizational rescue, geoengineering or carbon capture and storage. And I think what's missing, in a way, is that recognition that the past can help us navigate through the turbulence of our times, that in order to go forwards, we need to sometimes look backwards. A bit like driving a car. You wouldn't drive a car without looking in the rear vision mirror, would you? And so I think of history not so much as a clairvoyant, like a crystal ball that can predict the future. I have nothing to say about what will necessarily happen. But I think it can be not so much a clairvoyant as a counselor to help us find our way through. And that idea that you just heard about applied history, which is a kind of a minority sport amongst historians. You know, it's a kind of, it's something that's not very popular. There are not many places you can do a master's in applied history. There are a few around the world. But actually the idea of learning from history is a very ancient tradition, of course. It goes back to the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, to Machiavelli, to Hobbes, Or someone who I'm really inspired by is the writer Goethe, who in the early 1800s said, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." And I love that idea of sort of the past as a form of nourishment. We've got so much of this stuff to draw on, this vast layers of it. Why don't we do it more? Well, in some ways people do. Of course, there are a lot of historical thinkers who do draw on the past in a way reflecting that idea of, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that idea is very much associated with looking at the past for warnings, looking at everything that's gone wrong. So, we shouldn't be repeating what happened in colonialism or interwar fascism and things like that. And it's really important, of course, that we look at what we can learn from what's gone wrong. I spent 7 years of my life doing that, writing a PhD about Latin American colonial history and its current impacts. So I recognize we need to look at what's gone wrong, but what I've been doing in this new book is looking not just at what's gone wrong, but at what's gone right. Trying to learn not just from cautionary tales of the past, but from the moments of inspiration when humanity's managed to rise to the challenge of crises and tackle injustices. So the way this book works is I've taken 10 challenges facing humanity, like hyperconsumerism or like the climate crisis, like things like the threats from genetic engineering, and asked what can we learn from the last 1,000 years across different cultures and countries to help us tackle those in more effective ways. And tonight I'd like to share with you sort of 3 of those different topics, in a way 3 reasons for radical hope from history, and maybe also a little kind of theory of how I think historical change happens, or what I've learnt about it in the 4 years I've spent writing this book. But before I start telling you about what I think, I'd like to find out a little bit about what you think, or like you to find out from each other. So I invite you to do the following. When I give you the signal, but only when I give you the signal, I would like you to get into a little pair with a person next to you or behind you, ideally a stranger, and I want you to just spend 2 minutes talking with each other about that question there, which is, what's your relationship to history? Are you obsessed with history podcasts? Do you have a poster of Napoleon on your wall? Have you not read a history book since you were 13 years old? It doesn't matter. This is a place for reflection, so when I count to 3, I would like you to blow the roof off this lovely room with your conversations with your strangers for 2 minutes only. 1, 2, 3, go. Again, please. Thank you very much. I like your disobedience. In fact, I'm going to talk about disobedience. It's a good thing historically, but more of that later. So you've had a little bit of a chance to get your brains buzzing, and I love the energy in the room. Fantastic to hear your thoughts that you're sharing with each other. But now let me share with you some of these 3 reasons for radical hope that I see in history. And let's begin with this one, that there are alternatives to consumer capitalism. Sometimes we hear this phrase, sometimes attributed to the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And when I walk through my local shopping center, or in fact, actually, I was staying in Utrecht the other day, and the hotel I was staying in was like inside a shopping center. It was, I shopped there 4 a.m. Everything about, it was all about consumerism. And we sometimes say, I look at those places and think, how could we ever imagine anything different? How could we move beyond this? Because I think we need to, because of our material impacts on the earth. So it's quite interesting to stop and think, well, have there been moments in history where there have been sort of large-scale alternatives to the kind of economies we have now or consumer capitalism? In fact, there are some. And I want to share one of them with you, which is that I think we can find radical hope in ancient Japan. Now, imagine for a moment you are standing here on the old Nihonbashi Bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, today's Tokyo. So it's the year 1750, during the time of the Tokugawa shoguns. And you can see there people with their bamboo umbrellas. There are fish traders taking fish to the fish market, which is just on the other side of the bridge. People pushing cartloads of cotton or other things, rice maybe, over the bridge there. And one of the extraordinary things about Edo in the 18th century was it was a huge city. Over 1 million people lived there, so it was far bigger than London or Paris at the time. But the other thing about it, which was quite extraordinary, was that it operated what we would today call a circular economy. They basically reused, refurbished, repurposed, repaired, recycled almost everything. And that partly came out of the fact that at the time Japan was not trading with the outside world. So there were shortages of precious resources like wood or like cotton. So for example, as an example of how this circular economy worked, they developed a tradition of cloth making, garment making, known as boro. B-O-R-O is how it's normally spelt in English. And boro was about what you would do is you get old pieces of cotton and you would sew them together to make new garments. And these boro clothing was passed on from generation to generation. And in fact, I am wearing a boro jacket, as you can probably see, and this is over 100 years old, right? This is kind of standard clothing, as it were, from 18th century Japan. And, so they had things like the boro tradition, very circular. They had other traditions. So, for example, you might just have a normal kimono, and when it started wearing out, you might turn it into pajamas that you would wear at night, and then cut it up and turn it into nappies for your baby, and then turn it into cleaning cloths, and finally burn the precious cotton as fuel. There were thousands of circular businesses in Edo in the 18th century. There were people who would come and collect candle wax from your home, used candle wax, and then reshape it into candles. There were down-and-out samurai. You can see they're repairing old umbrellas. People would come to your house and buy your human waste off you and then sell it on as agricultural fertilizer. So the other thing about Japan, they also had, because of the shortage of timber, they also had rationing of timber so that they could regenerate their old-growth forests, which they chopped down before 1600. They also had mass plantation forestry. So if you stand back and look at Japan, particularly in the 18th century, it was a kind of, I think, one of the world's first large-scale examples of a low-carbon, low-waste ecological civilization. Very different from the kind of shareholder-driven consumer capitalism that we have today. It was a deeply sustainable economy. It was not a utopia by any means. It was a feudal society. It was a patriarchal society. It did have other things going for it, though. People often say, oh, environmentalists just want to take us back to living in the past, living in caves, things like that. But actually, Edo was a time of great cultural flourishing. It was the time of the paintings of Hiroshige, the poetry of Basho, sumo wrestling, what's not to like? So, though I'm not sure I quite want to be tugged quite like that. But the point, though, is that this was a kind of a fully formed society, one with cultural flourishing, one with deep sustainability, with all its own problems. But we can stop for a moment, just sort of take a historical breath and say, well, what would it mean to learn from this culture today? What would Edonomics look like in the 21st century? And if I think about it, I think like, if you take a standard smartphone, right? The standard smartphone has over 50 elements from the periodic table in it, so full of rare earth metals. They're thrown away after less than 3 years. So if we had an Edo kind of attitude to it, I don't think we would allow the sale of the standard kind of iPhone. We would phase them out. We would say to companies, look, in 5 years' time, you're not allowed to sell a phone like that. It has to be much more like the Fairphone, the Dutch Fairphone, the kind of phone which has recycled metals in it, which has modular design, so you can change the screen yourself, or the batteries, or the camera, these kind of things. And it doesn't require a military dictatorship like they had in Tokugawa, Japan, to do this. It just requires kind of regulation. We're already doing it, right? Many cities are saying no fossil fuel cars by 2030. And the manufacturers are adjusting to that. We should be doing it with a whole load of products to accelerate us towards a kind of Edonomics of circularity. So I think there's a lot of hope we can find in a different way of running our economies. In ancient Japan, there are other examples as well. Hawaii, before colonialism, before 1810, also had a circular economy, what's sometimes called the ancestral circular economy. So there are many different examples here. But let's move away from economics and start thinking about technology. And the idea that history can give us hope that we can prevail over me. And let me tell you what I mean by this. When I was doing research for this book, I discovered this extraordinary Islamic historian from the 14th century. Some of you may know him. I didn't know him till a few years ago, called Ibn Khaldun. And he wrote a book called the Muqaddimah. It was a kind of treatise on history. He wrote it in the early 1370s. He wrote it when he was living in this castle in West Algeria, and around him were all these crumbling, decaying cities and civilizations. And he asked himself, what is it that enables a city to thrive and survive, or what makes civilizations fail? And if you look through his book, the Muqaddimah, there's one word which appears over 500 times. It's an Arabic word which is asabiya. And asabiya is a term which means group feeling or collective solidarity. And Ibn Khaldun believed that the societies which thrived, civilizations which thrived, had strong asabiya, a kind of like social glue, social trust, really. And the ones that collapsed and crumbled, that broke down, were the ones that had weak asabiya. Lots of causes of that. It might be wealth inequality, which created instability and made them susceptible to outside invaders. But it was all about creating a bigger sense of we, really. And I think this is a really challenging issue today, particularly because of, for lots of reasons, partly because of the polarizations that we have in society. A lot of them exacerbated by new technologies, social media technologies, which get everybody, being fed the same news stories that by the algorithms, so they reinforce their existing views. So we've got this huge kind of polarization, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, climate change activists, climate change deniers, all sorts of different divides. To me, I think the interesting thing to ask historically is there anything a bit like the sort of polarizations we've developed out of social media in the past that we can learn from? And I think a really important and interesting place to go to, and you may have thought this already just in your head, which is another communications technology which emerged about 500 years ago, which was the printing press. Okay? Because the printing press is normally seen in quite a benevolent, positive way as something that spread education and literacy, but in fact, the printing press was responsible for an outbreak of polarization and violence. And let me just tell you something about this. In fact, let me show you something, which is a little prop I have here. I don't only have a Japanese borrowed jacket, but I also have here in my hands the world's first viral blog post from the year 1517. Well, this is a reproduction, I have to admit. This is Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which he nailed, apparently, to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in Germany. And, this was in Latin. And Martin Luther, of course, his friends then took the 95 Theses, critiquing the Catholic Church and critiquing its corruption, and they then reproduced it in German, translated into German, and then these translations spread like wildfire around German-speaking lands in the following years. And then Martin Luther, of course, was a very savvy social media operator. He then realized, next thing to do, let's translate the New Testament into German, so everyday people could read it, so it didn't have to go through the intermediaries of the priests. And then he knew, of course, that some people might be illiterate, so then he started producing pamphlets with cartoons like the one you can see on the right there with a figure with a donkey's head and kind of fish scale skin. Well, that's actually a picture of the Pope from 1523. So this was like pretty racy stuff. And as you'll see there in the graphic, in the infographic there, in the first 10 years of the Reformation, around 6 million pamphlets were printed in Europe, and 2 million of them, roughly, were the works of Martin Luther. So he really went viral. But the other thing that happened was that, on the one hand, it was a kind of very positive thing in a sense, because it allowed for the Protestant reformers to challenge the power of the Catholic Church. But it also inflamed the polarizations. And many, many historians have written a lot about this, the way in which the printing press was something that really exacerbated or inflamed the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, sort of souped it up to another level. I mean, the classic work on this is by Elizabeth Eisenstein, a book from the late 1970s, where she says Gutenberg's invention of the printing press probably contributed more to destroying Christian concord and inflaming religious warfare than any of the so-called arts of war ever did. So the idea that, sometimes we think of social polarization today with digital media, we think of it as kind of a new thing. No, it's been happening. It goes back 500 years. Something else that goes back 500 years is fake news, right? Here's some fake news from the year 1533, right? This is from a newspaper story or a broadsheet story about someone called the story. It's about a nameless maid called the Maid of Schiltach. And in 1533, she was accused of going to a small town in Germany, of riding on a broomstick with the devil by her side to go and burn it down. And the thing is that the commercial printers in Germany at the time, they loved stories about so-called witches, right? These sold like anything. So this was early clickbait, really, and it spread like wildfire. And then what the printers started doing, they started just completely making up things like, that she was topless and burnt like that and so on. They had no idea, but this is what helped sell broadsheets. It wasn't the only reason why these stories spread, but the printing press helped to do this. And, where I live in the UK, between about 1530 and 1680, about 500 people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft. In Germany, it was 25,000, right? And the printing presses had a major role to play in this. And today, I look at, actually in the UK, in the end of July, there was this case where somebody apparently assaulted a few people, and this piece of fake news went out that it was done by a asylum seeker, an undocumented asylum seeker, a Muslim undocumented asylum seeker. Completely fake news, and it sparked far-right riots across Britain, including targeting an asylum and refugee organization literally on the next street round from my house. And I couldn't help looking at this and thinking that we've been here before. The way that communication technologies become a tool for persecuting minorities, it's happening again. But is there any good story here with the printing press? There is, because this is a book I've written really a lot about hope, radical hope. One of the other things the printing press did in later years or later decades was that it helped create a culture of rights and democracy. And one of the ways it did this was in combination with another great technology. The printing press went along with this other technology called the coffee house. The coffee houses that emerged in Europe in the late 17th century, early 18th century, had a huge social impact. In London, for example, there are over 2,000 coffee houses by the year 1700. They come out of Turkey, starting in around 1650. A massive phenomenon. And the interesting thing, if you walked into one of the London coffee houses, you would be offered for 1 penny, a small amount of money, a cup or actually a bowl of coffee, normally, which you could sit on all day, like you kind of can do today in today's coffee shops. But the other thing that they had, which we tend not to have in today's coffee shop, was a communal table. And the communal table, and you can see them there in both of those images, was covered with pamphlets and periodicals. So this was the product of the new print culture. And you would sit there and talk with strangers about the issues of the day. There were coffee houses that specialized in scientific conversation or artistic conversation. But more than anything else, there were places for political talk, talking about the new ideas, republicanism, anti-slavery, for example. So what happened was, and if you read like the German philosopher, political philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote his PhD thesis all about the coffee houses. He talked about them being essential for the growth of the public sphere, a space where you could kind of learn to be a citizen, a kind of a school. They were schools of democracy in a way. And I think we can then pause for a moment again and bring ourselves back to the present and say, well, what can we learn from all of this kind of history? And I think that if we want to deal with some of the polarizations today, we need a bit of a historical caffeine fix. How might we kind of revive that coffee house culture of conversation? Well, we could try and do it online, and it's quite difficult doing that, as you will know from lots of online chat rooms, for political chat rooms like on Reddit and so on, partly because of anonymity and the lack of moderation or good moderators. They are full of invective and rudeness and people being horrible to each other, basically. There are some good online spaces which often have good moderation, based on subscriptions and things like that, aren't full of advertising, and those ones can work better. But I'm quite interested in how do we create or what do we learn from this history to kind of recreate the face-to-face conversations across divides, which I think are so essential for creating that asabiya that Ibn Khaldun was talking about. And I sometimes like to imagine, again, where I live in the UK, there are 30,000 coffee houses that have emerged, a kind of explosion of them like in the early 1700s. In those 30,000 coffee houses, if there were just 10 conversations between strangers a day, in 1 year that would make over 100 million conversations. Just imagine that. And the good news is that there are lots of dialogue projects out there in the world that are trying to do something like this. There's the Death Cafe movement, you can see up there, which is an organization which holds events in normal coffee shops where people sit down and meet every month and they'll talk about death. It exists in over 80 countries. They've had more than 15,000 meetings. The other image there is from a project that I used to be involved in. I used to run an organization called the Oxford Muse, spelled M-U-S-E, like the muses of mythology. And that organization was invented to create conversations between strangers. So we'd invite 500 people to a public park or here into a local school gymnasium, people from different walks of life, rich and poor, different religions and backgrounds and age groups. And we give them a meal, but instead of giving them a menu of food, we gave them a menu of conversation with questions about life on it, like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in the course of your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? Or how have your priorities changed over the years? So it's kind of the opposite of speed dating. You talk for 1 hour, not for 1 minute. But I think this is the kind of thing we need to begin to knit ourselves back together again. And I think these dialogue kinds of projects are really important, even in some of the most politically difficult situations. So for many years, I've been following an organization in Palestine, Israel, called the Parents Circle. And they do dialogue projects between Palestinians and Israelis who've got something in common, that they've all had family members killed in the conflict. And they run these projects. One of the projects that they did is called the Hello Peace telephone line. This was a few years ago. And what they did is they set up a free telephone number. And any Israeli could call this free telephone number, and they were put through to a Palestinian stranger, a volunteer, who they could speak to about anything for up to 30 minutes. And then the Palestinians could call Israelis on a similar number, and they could have a conversation for half an hour as well. And in its first 5 years of operation, over 1 million conversations occurred on the Hello Peace telephone line. And that's what I mean about the sort of ambition of creating asabiya. We need to be creative about how we create dialogues and, in effect, learn from that coffee culture from the 18th century. But talking is not enough alone. I think we also need to think about how we redesign our political institutions. And this is another area where I think there is hope in history, that democracy can be redesigned. Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other kinds that have been tried from time to time. I think he was wrong, because actually, if you look through history, we've had very different ways of governing ourselves, different forms of democracy, which I kind of think we've almost forgotten. But we need to remember them. The other night, I did an event with the Belgian historian and political writer David van Rijbroek, who's written a great book called Against Elections. And he talks there about democratic fatigue syndrome, that we are in a culture today, a moment of history, in a way, where there's huge declining trust in traditional parties and institutions, which partly is what fuels the rise of anti-system parties in the Netherlands and in other countries, of course, the rise of the far right. Also, we've got more authoritarian governments than at any time in the last 30 years, so a rise of autocratization. And we also know that traditional representative government, where we elect members of parliament to rule on our behalves, have pretty much systematically failed to deal with major crises like the climate emergency. In 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, the alarm bells began to ring about climate change. And yet in the 3 decades since then, global carbon emissions have more than doubled. So I don't have a lot of faith in our existing representative democratic systems. I say this as someone who used to be a lecturer in political science. I've got a PhD in political science. And in fact, I used to teach democracy. And I used to think that the only kind was representative government. The kind of, there's a little variations. Do you have proportional representation or the mad British first past the post system or whatever it is? But actually, when I started looking through history, there's so much more. One example is a form of government which is a kind of much more direct participatory form of government without needing electing representatives on our behalf, which you might call a kind of form of assembly government. One of the places you can find it amongst Igbo peoples in Nigeria. When the British colonialists went to Igbo lands in the 19th century, they found it a bit weird because they couldn't find any leaders. They couldn't find any chiefs. They assumed that there must be a chief. It must be a kind of a hierarchy. But no, amongst Igbo peoples, they have a very different form of government where they basically have a kind of system of communal assemblies. So you'd have kind of village-level assemblies where anyone could come along, adults, but men and women. And then sometimes if they had a bigger decision to make or in a larger area, they would then send delegates, like almost ambassadors rather than representatives, up to the next level, which might be councils of village elders. And then they had these sort of various layers going up, but it was very much a bottom-up form of government, and very different from what we have today. And this kind of model you can find in other moments of history and in other geographies as well. So one of the best kept secrets in the history of democracy is a place called the Free State of Rhaetia, or the Republic of the Three Leagues, in part of what is now Switzerland. And between 1523 and 1799, this three kind of cantons got together, and they formed like a mini republic, but it was still quite large. And it was basically a form of kind of anarchist government, in a way. You know, they had these about 200 or 250 neighborhood councils where they'd make local decisions on what local taxes should be, or about, we need to repair the alpine paths. And then for bigger decisions, they went up to these commune level where there were 49 communes. And then for bigger decisions than that, they had a kind of a Bundestag, a kind of federal assembly that met a couple of times a year to talk about defense and things like that. And this lasted for, over 2 centuries. Again, it wasn't perfect. It was quite complicated, but it kind of worked. And it was, something that was very different, again, from what we have today. It was about direct representation. And on the right-hand side, you can see another example of this, which exists today, which is in the Kurdish-controlled area of Syria, today an area called Rojava. And you may have heard of this. There's a region of around 4 to 5 million people that have a very similar form of assembly government. They have local neighborhood councils, which then send delegates up to higher levels. They also have thematic councils on health and finance. And one of the differences with some of these past ones, like the Free State of Rhaetia, was basically only men, no women allowed. It was included, workers as well as aristocrats, so it was kind of inclusive in its sense. But what they do in Rojava, in the Kurdish-controlled Syria, is that they're very much conscious of gender imbalances. So every council has both a male and a female chair. And I heard just the other night from someone who'd recently been there that in some areas, no meeting starts until a woman speaks, which I think is rather interesting. But this is all a totally different kind of democracy than we have today, much more direct, much more participatory. But a second form of participatory democracy, apart from this sort of assembly government, is what's sometimes called sortition. And I asked someone a bit earlier today, is there a Dutch word for sortition? And there wasn't exactly the right kind of word for this, but sortition is the idea of selecting people for public office by randomly, like out of a bag, like a stone out of a bag, like a public lottery. And this is what they had in ancient Greece, right? They had one of the main forms of political decision-making, the Council of 500, was chosen from Athenian citizens. Now, it was limited in its way because the Athenian citizens were just men only, no refugees, no immigrants, right? Maybe that's a kind of a dream for some political parties today. But so they had this direct form of democracy, but they had this selection by lot, a bit like in the UK when you've got jury service, you're selected randomly for that. And this kind of model of sortition or random selection existed throughout Europe, particularly between about the 13th and 18th centuries, in Republican Florence, in Frankfurt, in parts of Spain. The picture there is for the election of the Doge of Venice. The leader of Venice was done through a basically random selection, admittedly amongst just the aristocracy, to stop the aristocratic families fighting with each other, so that they at least felt it was kind of fair, the system. But this idea of random selection exists today, as you know, in the idea of the citizen assembly. This new form of government, which is really an old form of governing, which has exploded across Europe, particularly in the last decade, where there have been more than 250 of these citizens' assemblies where randomly selected members of the public are chosen to discuss an issue, maybe 100 people, like abortion in Ireland, or there have been climate assemblies on climate change in France and in Spain. I think there's going to be a big climate one in the Netherlands coming up, a national level one. And they have them in cities and so on. And people are selected with an algorithm to make sure that there is a balance of gender balance and ethnic background balance and age balances and things like that. And they're really quite interesting forms of a new form of government. I think it's one of the most exciting changes in democracy since the extension of the right to vote to women in the early 20th century. In the bottom of the image there, you can see me speaking at a citizens' assembly in Ireland, a citizens' assembly on biodiversity loss. And I was a little bit skeptical when I went along. There were 100 randomly selected members of the Irish citizenry. In fact, it also included non-citizens, included asylum seekers as well. And people from all walks of life. It was the most diverse group I've ever spoken to. There were shoe shop assistants and pig farmers and lawyers and all sorts of people. And the really interesting thing was that biodiversity loss is quite a technical subject. There's a lot of stuff about EU law in there as well as complex ecology. And I thought, will people be able to really discuss this? People that don't have, most people didn't have, educational qualifications and things like that, or university qualifications. But actually, by the end of the first day, 1 in 4 of those 100 people had stood up and asked a question to the expert panelists who were speaking, people like me or ecologists and lawyers. And when I sat in the discussions where they talk about the issues in like groups of 8 or 10 people, people were just, after a few hours, they were asking really smart questions, really on the topic. And it was incredibly impressive. So I think we need to expand this second form of democracy today as well. In the UK, the House of Lords, the upper house, is chosen by, through inheritance. And I'm trying to, with others, say, well, why don't we have our equivalent of your Senate selected by random selection, so not be a House of Lords, but a House of Citizens. And in fact, I was speaking in the Dutch Parliament on Monday, and I suggested this to some of the senators, and they weren't quite on board with it yet. But I said, well, at least maybe half of you could be selected randomly from citizenry. And some were saying, let's talk about that. But anyway, so I do think we need to redesign democracy, and history is a huge source of inspiration for that. But let me now finally move on to a sort of more general point about how historical change happens. Now, I don't believe that there are any kind of iron laws of history like Karl Marx did. I think nothing in history is inevitable until it happens. But I think there are some patterns that you can see holding or working for over certain periods of time and in certain places. And one of the key patterns I've noticed through the research in my book is what you can see on the screen there, that disruptive movements can change the system. I think this is particularly noticeable since the 18th century, early 19th century. And the reason I got interested in this topic or got led to it was because out of a kind of frustration that, so often, you look at the world and think, God, there are all these huge crises going on. There's a financial crash in 2007. There's melting ice sheets and floods in Germany or whatever. And yet our governments just don't do anything. Like, what does it take? How bad does the crisis have to get? And of course, governments do act sometimes. They act during a Second World War. They enacted radical policies, or in the Netherlands after the 1953 floods, they built the Delta Works, stuff like that, or after a pandemic. But apart from those moments, those extreme moments, when do governments enact rapid transformative change? Because I think this is really important for tackling particularly the ecological crisis. And what I noticed was a kind of a pattern which amounted to a kind of a model of change, a triangular model I called the disruption nexus. And it's a model of how change happens, which has sort of 3 elements to it. I think you need all 3 of these elements, often, not always, in order to create rapid transformative change. So one thing you need is some kind of crisis, like a financial crash, like a flood or something like that. Not normally as extreme as a war. The second thing you need is disruptive social movements that can amplify that sense of crisis, put it onto the top of the political agenda. And the third thing you need are ideas. You need visionary models, new ideas, or sometimes even old ideas that can take the place of the old system. So the economist Milton Friedman, who I don't quote very often, did once say that, a crisis is an opportunity for change, but the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And it's very important to have that third element. So if you think, for an example, like Berlin, 1989, the collapse of state socialism in East Germany, well, what happened? I think you had those three elements of the disruption nexus. You had a crisis in the East German governing leadership, partly because they were arguing over the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev and how they should respond to those. You had the ideas floating around, in a way old ideas around freedom of movement, freedom of speech, democratic freedoms. And then you had, and some of those came out of people like Václav Havel's essays on the power of the powerless. And then you had the great uprisings, the great movements of 100,000 people on the streets of Leipzig in October 1989, and then in early November, people on the streets of Berlin and other cities, which finally on November the 9th tipped the system. So I think you need those three elements, and you can see sometimes what happens when we don't have all those elements. So like in the 2008 financial crash, we had the crisis, we had the movements, the Occupy movement, which spread around the world, but I don't think we had the new economic models to replace the old system, or they weren't enough embedded in public life, so you ended up getting a bailing out of the old system, and we've basically still got what we had before the financial crash. We didn't have things like post-growth economics or donor economics or all these alternatives which we have today. And I think if you look through history, it's very clear that particularly the disruptive movements are a real constant, very important, that you can see the way that disruptive movements help push forward the abolition of slavery in Britain, or the Indian independence movement, the civil rights movement, the suffragettes in Britain and Finland. But the kind of tragedy of it all is that, in a way, some of those past figures, up there you can see Martin Luther King Jr., obviously, and Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette who was campaigning for votes for women in Britain in the early 20th century. Both of them rule breakers, law breakers. But, if I go to my kids' school, and look in the textbook, their figures like Emmeline Pankhurst and Martin Luther King Jr. are celebrated in the textbooks. And yet, we've got figures from today's ecological movement who are basically inheritors of that same tradition of disruption, and they are being demonized by the press, or they're being arrested and put in jail. Right now in the UK, there are 30 people from the organization Just Stop Oil in prison. One of them in prison, I just sent him a copy of my book, actually. It's a guy I know, in prison for 4 years for just being on a Zoom call. Just being on a Zoom call about organizing a road protest, a road blockage. It's really extraordinary. So I think that illustrates a failure, really, to understand what democracy looks like, how change happens. I think it's too late to leave the problems of our time to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. And that's why I've spent some of my time recently getting out of the library, where I've been learning about the power of disruptive movements, and I've gone with my teenage daughter to block the roads with Extinction Rebellion and others sometimes, out of frustration with the lack of speed of change. And I know when I'm lying on the road that I'm annoying the commuters, but I think we are infuriating future generations even more by our obsession with a kind of business as usual gradualism. So I think we can stand back from what I've said now, and I think recognize that, when I look through history and what I've learned through writing this book, and there's so many other topics we haven't spoken about, but we might speak about some of them later on, what I see is possibility. What I see is that it doesn't have to be this way. With only a bit of historical imagination, actually, we could change the way our politics work, the way our economies work, the way our societies and cultures function. I think even though it can seem so difficult to create change, I think we always have to act as if change were possible. Those two little words, as if, I think have been something that have powered people like those campaigning for independence of India from Britain. Did they really think they could overthrow this huge colonial monstrosity? Well, they probably didn't, but they did act as if they could. And sometimes we do manage to achieve that kind of change. So there is, I believe, hope in history. And I think if we are going to survive and navigate our way through the turbulence of our times, we need to learn to look in that rear view mirror. In a way, we need to learn from the great Maori proverb from Aotearoa, New Zealand, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. And I think it's such a powerful, important saying that I would love you all to say it with me in Maori. Okay, so I'd like you just to repeat after me in 2 parts. Here we go. I want you to be loud, like really loud. Okay, here we go. Kia whakatomori. Te haere whakamoa. Okay, let's do it even louder than that. Here we go. Kia whakatomori. Te haere whakamoa. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. But one last thing before we move into the conversations. I would like you to talk with each other just once more. I've been giving you some ideas about where to find hope in history, but you may have some of your own. You might find hope in history in your own family or in something in your own community or from your, general knowledge and general reading. So what I'd like you to do again is to get into a pair, or ideally with someone different, maybe someone the same if you like to, and spend 2 minutes in pairs talking about this question: where do you see hope in history? So on the count of 3, once again, blow the roof off, make the bricks shake with your conversations. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, can I have your attentions again, please? Now this is really disobedient and disruptive. I love it. It's great. Now, of course, I'm curious to hear about all the different examples of hope from history that you've got, but just hold on to them for a moment and hold on to any questions that you've got, because we'll have a chance to discuss your thoughts. But we're now going to move on to the next part of the evening, which is conversation. Adrian's going to come onto the stage. Do I want to say something about the book?
Yeah.
There's a book. I've written a book. Yeah. So, if it sounds interesting, have a read.
There you go. So indeed, we'll go back to your discussions later on, and we'll open this 18th century coffee house for all. But before doing that, I have a question for you both, but I will start with Charley. If you would have gotten the choice, in which time period in history would you have loved to be born?
As a woman, there's not so many options. Right? I think the further back in time we go, the less ideal for me, unfortunately.
I see the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And me? I would go back to the year 1000, to the Spanish city of Cordoba. Huge city at the time, over 300, 400,000 people. And it was a period which, some historians called the convivencia, the living together or coexistence, because it was a time when Muslims, Christians, and Jews managed to coexist reasonably together in a kind of a complex culture of tolerance. There was everyday tensions, there were occasional outbreaks of violence, but by and large, in everyday life, people managed to get on. And I write about this in the book, but I'd be really curious to go back there and think, what can we learn from that for looking at our world today?
Okay, I see your point, and maybe we go back to Cordoba later, because it's a very interesting example. I found it one of the most interesting passages of your book. But do you think that life in Cordoba was better than it is now?
What is better? No smartphones, I think the way to look at that, one of the things about Cordoba and the whole area of Al-Andalus, the Islamic kingdom of Spain at that time, which lasted for several centuries. So it was sort of a period where, Muslim culture was dominant, but Jews and Christians had the right to practice their own religions and things like that. I think one of the things about it is that what was really interesting is that Jews wanted to migrate to Andalusia at the time. So was life better? Not better if you were a woman. Maybe, all sorts of, not better if you were a slave, right? Because there was slavery there too, in various forms. I don't write about that in the book, but there are areas of that. So it was, how do we think about, it's hard enough to compare happiness or well-being across cultures today. And there are all these surveys that say, the Costa Ricans are so happy and the Bulgarians are miserable. But it all depends on how you think about it. To do it through history is even harder than that. I don't know. What do you think?
Where Adrian?
Where I would love to.
I'm asking you.
I actually would prefer living now, and that's also you go through history to find lessons to be learned. But I think that if you look at all the statistics, life hasn't been as good as it is now on Earth So why should we learn from history if the world and all these statistics is immensely better?
Well, first, I think that is a Steven Pinker-esque view of the world, which I just think is missing a lot, and I'm sure you probably agree with this, too, and you're just trying to provoke me.
I'm going to do that more this evening.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's been so-called progress in certain areas, like, in the 18th century in Europe, if you, committed crimes, you might be tortured for it or executed for it publicly. Today, that doesn't happen in quite the same way. There's been progress in the area of legal violence. But, there are other areas where, Steven Pinker drives me mad. I mean, my kids know more than he does about human history. My children learned at the age of 4 that you can't keep blowing up a balloon with the prospect that it's never going to burst. Yet he seems to think that our economies can keep growing and growing and growing. So the idea that, we've never had it so good, in many ways, we've never had it so dangerous either. So risky, crossing dangerous tipping points of climate change, of biodiversity loss, ocean acidification.
So one of the things you both share with Steven Pinker, if I may say so, is that you are both
Not a haircut, by the way.
Not a haircut, no. I wish I had his haircut. But that you're both not historians, doing history or studying history. Beginning with Charley, can you really shortly summarize what your topic is and how you approach that as a cultural studies scholar?
Yeah. So I research 3 particular European famines, so periods of hunger from the 19th and 20th century. But rather than reconstruct what happened, I look at how their cultural afterlives, them as heritage, remembered in film, memorials, museum exhibitions, how this lives on and influences identity making, transcultural solidarity, but also ethnic exclusivity, exclusive national identities, etc. So I deal with these very violent and traumatic histories, but rather than figure out what is fact, right, go into archives or do oral history, I look at how are they remembered, how does this help us or people make sense of the present, and what visions of the future does this remembrance propose.
And as a cultural studies scholar, do you approach then history differently than a historian would do?
I think so. I mean, I found when there are historians at my presentations, I've realized that we do things differently.
Like in what way?
I mean, sometimes, and not all historians do this. I think they've come very far.
You're sitting right next to one just there.
Yeah, we've talked about this. No, I think, for example, for me, I find it incredibly boring to look at a film about a famine and only look at it and say, this is wrong, oh, that's wrong, actually it was like this. I don't think that matters so much. It's a film. It sparks imagination, affect, and I'm more interested in what that does. And of course, I will look at why are certain choices made, right? If there is something radically different in a film than what actually happened, I'm interested in why that choice was made and what that does to our imagination of this past. But I won't reject the film on the basis of like historical inaccuracy. And I think this is where I find with historians that they are still very attached to fact, and I am much less attached to fact and reconstruction.
And the social philosopher
So
going to history, are you attached to facts or?
Well, I'm not a professional historian. I'm not like a professor of history at any university or something, but my relationship with history goes back a long way in the sense that my stepmother was a high school history teacher. And so around the kitchen table, we would always be talking about history, or she would be talking about the great figures of history who've been forgotten, like the medieval polymath Hildegard of Bingen. Or she'd talk about how you can't understand the wars of the former Yugoslavia unless you understand hundreds of years of conflicts between Serbs and Croats. Or she was driven crazy by the privatization of public services because she knew how hard people had fought to bring them into public ownership in the first place in the 19th, early 20th centuries. Water, for example, or public transport. So I kind of inherited that, I think. And then when I started doing a PhD in a political science department, a very quantitative political science department, everybody wanted to basically do political maths. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to study Guatemala's oligarchy, the rich elites, the coffee plantation owners who'd collaborated with the military on a genocide of indigenous people. But in order to understand how their power worked, I realized I needed to understand hundreds of years of Latin American colonial history, how the power structures had developed and things like that, and what were their narratives. And again, it's not about facts, it's about how they construct the past. How do they talk about who they are, their role in nation building, about communism, or all sorts of different things. So I got drawn into history, and I think this is really common amongst sociologists, political scientists. Often, almost most sort of theories in politics have basically come out of historical research of some kind. I can't help doing it, like you saw in that disruption nexus diagram, or the Nobel Prize winning person who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, Eleanor Ostrom, right, came up with this idea of the commons. She identified 8 principles which allow us to, communities around the world and through history have collectively managed resources like fisheries and water and things like that. And that was, she had to do historical research to do that. So I just think of myself as a kind of an ambassador for all the amazing historical research has done, which I'm reliant upon. That's why there's over like 400 bibliographic references in my book. I don't really know that much about witchcraft in 16th century Germany. I've had to learn from the people who are experts, and thank God those experts exist, but it's sort of about being a translator, in a sense.
And you translate a lot in the book. There are examples from all over the world and from various epochs. Was there a long list? Was it hard to make the selection, or is this just the few examples, or is this all you got?
Right, yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask, like, did I just cherry pick examples from the past to suit my own arguments and that kind of thing? I tried to be as systematic as possible with my cherry picking from the past. I think there are no objective sciences or social sciences. Every economist is choosing which kind of measure to use, what time period to look at, to measure GDP in this way or measure this something else in that way, or the number of firms. Every sociologist, everybody's doing it, right? I think historians are no different, right? They're choosing time periods, they're choosing geographies, they're choosing quantitative, qualitative, they're thinking about whether to look at technology or culture or identity, all sorts of stuff. So I just try to be as honest as I can about it. So the way I did it, okay, I started with the present moment. I read the literature on civilizational collapse and all the threats facing society today, and I identified 10 risks facing us, and that's the 10 chapters. And then I asked, what are the bits of history we can learn from for those, which means I haven't written about the history of medieval tennis, because I don't think it's relevant, even though I have actually written a book on the history of medieval tennis.
So you're playing it on YouTube?
Yes, exactly.
It's impressive.
And then I sort of look at, okay, let's find examples which are not just warnings from the past, but about inspiration, when things have gone right, not just gone wrong. And then I looked at another layer of, let's not just look at where leaders have done things, but when collective groups have done things. And then there's other layers below that. So, in any one example, I could have chosen many examples. Like I mentioned there, the Edo Japan, you could have drawn on pre-colonial Hawaii. So I only try and, in a way, showing the top of the iceberg.
Critics of applied history often say that it reduces history to some kind of grab bag, grabbelton, from which you can just randomly pick some examples to tell a story. How would you counter this criticism?
Do you want to counter this criticism?
I mean, I think in a way that you described your book, you already counter this criticism because it's very clearly an organized picking with a reasoning behind it, which to make your book an incredibly pleasant read, you don't all lay out in the introduction, but it is there. And I also think it's incredibly fair, as you say, that history as a discipline, picks, sets borders, time, sources, who you look at. So you're always a imperfect reconstruction. And I think what I really appreciated about your book is that you, in the introduction, very clearly say, history is abused by terrible leaders, by violent groups, and in a way, you're not saying you're going to abuse history, but you're saying like, okay, well, let's do something different with history. It's always kind of cherry picking or an imperfect artificial reconstruction.
What do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, you call yourself an applied historian on your website.
I'm the interviewer here, but I'm going to introduce. I think that I'm going to. So to make this more sharp. I'm going to introduce a Jekyll and Hyde scenario. I'm going to introduce your academic evil twin, a man with your academic credibility and charisma, but he is a staunch capitalist and a staunch conservative. Let's call him Niall Ferguson.
Yeah.
And then we go to your example of Al-Andalus, of Cordoba, this wonderful utopian city where every religion could live together. What kind of story would you think he would tell with this anecdote?
Aha, that's a brilliant question. What would he say? Firstly, I don't think he's actually written about this period himself. If he did,
he writes about every period.
I tell you what I think he would say. I mean, this is speculative. I mean, he's not here. I don't think. He may be listening online. Who knows? Hello. He's someone who's written a lot about the history. He loves free markets. Mm-hmm. And I think what he would probably say was that what created tolerance in Andalusia in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries was the fact that people were trading with each other in these big cities. And that brought people from different cultures together. Meeting face to face, a Jewish physician needing the services of a Muslim carpenter and vice versa. I think that might be one route that he would go down. And weirdly enough, I might actually agree with him. That actually there's something about not so much early capitalism, but about urban life. Cities are actually really good technologies for mixing together people of difference. And you can look at this today, and of course we know that cities are also places of conflict, right? Of, whether it's the outskirts of Paris or the barrios of East LA with their, racist policing, of course. But survey after survey of tolerance levels in cities show that basically the larger the city is, with each degree of increasing size of a city, you get an exponential kind of jump in the degree of tolerance. And that's why the Netherlands is no different, that you've got your urban areas and then you've got your suburban and rural areas, which have very different degrees of tolerance. And there's lots of reasons for that. It partly has to do with who you interact with and don't interact with. But I'm just saying this is a kind of a general rule of thumb.
But okay, then, sorry.
No, I just, like the sort of the speculative or narrative that you just described is, I think, exactly what is being said about Netherlands, early capitalism and tolerance. Like it's the sort of the tolerance free market myth of the Netherlands. And so I think it makes sense as a speculative, because I think this narrative exists about the Netherlands.
Right, yes.
As an early economy, capitalist economy. Yeah.
Not to channel Niall Ferguson here, but maybe another critical historian, the Dutch Martin Bosma. Again, back to Cordoba. Maybe the lesson to be learned, Martin Bosma would say, is that actually the Jewish population, the Christian population, were second-rate citizens, where Arabic was was the official language, and everything should be in Arabic. And Christians and Jewish people had to pay additional taxes, lived in other neighborhoods, and it was very clear, to use the German word, that there was a Leitkultur. And actually the lesson to be learned from Cordoba is that if you want a sustainable, harmonious, multi-religious society, you just have to have a strong, dominant group. Yeah. Is this a good interpretation of your example?
I can see why some people might look at it that way. And it's certainly true that, Jews and Christians did not have the same social standing or political standing. There were exceptions. So there was a guy called Samuel Harnarid, who was from a Jewish spice trading family, who learned Arabic. In fact, was so good, his Arabic script was so beautiful that the Muslim leader of the Kingdom of Granada basically employed him first to be his private secretary, then his prime minister, and then to lead his military forces. Right? So there's this incredible kind of cross-cultural interaction, and you can go to the city of Toledo in Spain today and still see synagogues from that time which have Hebrew script and Arabic script there as well. But the idea that it was the domination, which is what created the human relationships, I don't know how you would really make that argument in a strong way. I think when people say that kind of argument, I sort of say, well, look, if they were so dominating, why did so many Jews immigrate there? It was a hell of a lot better to live there than to live in other parts of Christian-controlled Europe. And think what happened in Spain after the collapse of Al-Andalus. You had the Inquisition. You had full-on massacres of Jewish population. So, but I think what I love about this period in Spain, the convivencia, is that it's complicated. That's why we're talking about it. It's not a utopia by any means, and I try not to paint it that way. I know medieval historians, they're incredibly aggressive about this period of relative peace, because they're all fighting about, was this period really an invention of the Spanish tourist board, a sort of harmony between nations? But actually, even if you look at the biggest critics of convivencia, will say, and who want to point out the elements of violence, they'll say basically for most of the time in everyday life, people kind of got on. And I think there's something important in that today. I tell you what I think is the final conclusion I draw from it is, I think there's really still a strong narrative of the idea of the clash of civilizations, that inevitably we cannot live together. And I think just Cordoba and southern Spain says, maybe that's not right.
Interesting how much hope you get from history. And to end this interview part then, going to Charley, you looked in the most horrific episodes of human history. Could you find hope there?
Oh yeah, 100%. But it depends sometimes a bit which part you look at. So in most research shows that in the early phases of famine, there's a lot of collectivity. So there are soup kitchens, help. But then the further on you get in the crisis, this disappears. And when famines last very long or are incredibly extreme, then solidarity and sort of helping your neighbor diminishes in favor of your own survival. And then everyone, unfortunately, usually has to do things they don't want to do in order to survive. But in early phases, you can see a lot of impulse to help and wanting to do good. So I think that is hopeful.
Can I ask an additional question to that? Or actually, can I ask you a question about this? Again, I read an article of yours about the floods in Groningen in 1718.
1717.
Sorry, 1717. Got my year wrong, sorry. Okay. Out by 1 year, that's not bad.
It was the Christmas flood. So basically
floods,
it was...
So they went over into 1718.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's partly the same story here about a crisis creating solidarity, right?
That's true, but indeed the same goes there. Famines are different from floods because they are long-stretched disasters. And if there's a flood, it's easier to be solidary because there's one moment and after. Anyway, it's not about my PhD. That's years ago.
It's a really interesting article. Basically, people like that go and pray together, and then out of that, they started financially helping people and bringing in refugees. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, maybe we should all become more religious. That's a lesson from history. No, Charley, to then, and then we really go to the audience. In your research, you see hopeful moments. Do you also see the nexus of change? Did a famine ever change a society for the good?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. Let me think. I think, as you just said, they are temporally quite usually slow and long events. So I don't think there's this crisis moment where it can kind of swoop everything with it. And I think usually with famines, it's only after a while that people start to not remember them, but politicize them, maybe. So I don't think it has this temporal swooping moment as 2008 crisis might have had, and then you can have Occupy or other sort of spectacular events that make sense on your screens, right? Famines also don't lend themselves to spectacular visual news items usually.
They're interesting, actually. The the Live Aid concerts and stuff in the 1980s. Yeah. I mean, that's in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
Sort of sparked something.
Yeah.
Though I mean, that's very different from the response to the Finnish famine of 1866 or 68 or whatever it was, or the Ukrainian famines and things like that.